Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times bestselling author. Looking for ways to help your clients become less susceptible to market fluctuations and peer influence? Get powerful personalization for every investor with Orion Custom Indexing, our tech-enabled solution for managing tax-efficient, customized portfolios at scale. Learn more at orion.com/custom indexing.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and today I'm joined by Sterling Johnson, Just Opportunity Portfolio Director at the Partnership for Southern Equity, an organization working to advance policies and institutional actions that promote racial equity and shared prosperity for all in the growth of the American South. Welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me, Dr. Crosby. I appreciate the opportunity.
No, it's great to have you here. Introduced to me by a friend of the show, Adam Tolliver, who's a great human being and a great advisor. I want to start just quickly by learning a little bit more about you and the Partnership for Southern Equity and your role there. What are you all about?
We are a racial justice nonprofit, a 501c3, located here in the city of Atlanta. We're anchored here. We're founded here. And our focus is on how do we advance institutional action and policy that promotes racial equity and shared prosperity for all. And so we do that through a number of different ways. We're active in researching, in program design and deployment, re-granting, work, and have grown as an intermediary for smaller nonprofits as well. And then we think about this work in the way of how do we make cases for it? Basically, how do we create a different type of environment, right? That where race is not a social determinant of outcomes for individual people. We, of course, are, like I said, anchored here in Atlanta, but we're a regional nonprofit. So our focus is on Atlanta and the American South, which on any particular day could be the contiguous southern states or southeastern states, or it could be anywhere under Canada if you ask our founder and Chief Equity Officer, Mr. Nathaniel Smith. And so we try to just add value to wherever we can in this fight for liberation for Black and brown people.
A beautiful mission. But before we dive in, I think we need to take, we could probably spend the whole hour having a conversation about just definitional stuff. But I think there's one that we got to make sure that we get right, because it's one that honestly, I think has confused me historically, and I think there's a meaningful difference. What's the difference between equity and equality, and why is it a meaningful difference for the kind of work that y'all are trying to do?
Absolutely. I appreciate you for asking this question, because it's something that oftentimes gets misconstrued, right? That in the pursuit for equality is that we try to put equality on as the remedy, right? And we recognize and understand that if you give everyone the same thing, if people are starting from different points of view or have different needs and that have to be accommodated, then giving me the same thing and giving you the same thing aren't going to get us to a place of equality. It's just going to get us to the same place where there's a gap or some sort of disparity between us. And so when we have this conversation about the difference between equity and equality, is that equity is a proactive strategy that accounts for differences and the lived needs or lived experiences of people. We know, of course, in the history of America that lived experience of Black people in particular has been centered on disenfranchisement through different forms, whether that be from this inception in the original sin of chattel slavery or through the racially restrictive covenants of public policy, and how those have been reinforced over time through our court system and our legal system. And so when we look at interventions that were attempted, like things like the Equal Protections Clause, or looking at things like fair housing, right, and these types of on its face, equality promoting policies, that they don't include oftentimes a very specific remediation tool in the midst of them. And so we see that when you look at the data, for example, about fair housing between now and the point that when the Fair Housing Act was passed, right, that home ownership rates are flat or in some areas have declined even since that time. And so how do we start to take into account what equity is in the sense that we're going to give reparative thought and justice-oriented action to the way that we're looking to promote and get ourselves to an equal society?
So this isn't, I sent you the questions before. This isn't one of them, but your comments there kind of made me think about it. Mm-hmm. I think some of the pushback against the type of work y'all are trying to do, I think often comes from this idea that systemic inequality is a thing of the past. Like,
Right.
does that make sense? So it's like, yeah, like Jim Crow was horrible, but that was a long time ago.
Right.
But I think sometimes people are not aware of some sort of the systematic inequalities that exist even today. They're not aware of like the history of redlining and inequitable lending practices. Are there things still in place structurally that disadvantage Black and brown people from economic equality?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think of a quote that we like to share in our trainings and in our programming by James Baldwin, where he talks about history isn't the past, it's still the present, right? And you talk about systems, and that systems, what we believe organizationally and through the way that we do our work and seek to go out and make transformational change in the world around us, is that values inform systems, right? And that public policy is a moral document that's reflective of the values of people in power, right? And so we know that when we look across the history of the Americas, that there was a very specific value that was assigned to and looked at through the lens of how you interact with Black and brown people, that Black people in particular were seen as commodities, right, within an economic system that was used to drive specific types of wealth generation. Then we look at how we relate to Black people as a subsequent, or as a result of that, is that we think about them as not as being capable of being owners or capable of being independent, right? Like there's a lot of rhetoric, if you want to go back and look through, around the thoughts and feelings and beliefs of Black and brown people, down to the fact that we were considered not even to be fully human, right? And so when we think about the kind of chattel nature of that relationship, right, this commodified nature of the relationship between Black and brown people, then you see that the value has always been that Black people exist in this world to generate wealth and value for white people. And so when we look at our economic systems, even though we might not have segregation legally in place the way that it had been in the past, or certain types of, like I said, slavery and otherwise that are still in the forms that they were in that particular time, that we have to recognize and understand that that value proposition still undergirds all of our economic models that were built in that time and continue to perpetuate themselves today. And so when you see things like the widening of the racial wealth gap, right? One, the equity strategy in the midst of that hasn't taken into account that there was a period where wealth was generated off the trade value and the production and free labor of slaves or enslaved people, right? There was no reparative relationship to close that gap in the past. And so we kind of gloss over the fact that when we're trying to get to this equality stage or this kind of race neutral society, is that we're not comfortable talking about the history that we were all actively or engaged in that generated certain types of lived experiences for people today, right? And so that same type of value proposition undergirds our economic models. It's the same type of value system that sees Black and brown communities and low wealth communities. We were talking right before we got on the call about things like gentrification and the displacement effect that's happening around the metro area, that these are all really offshoots of that same value proposition that saw Black and brown people and Black and brown communities subsequently as being less valuable, right? More prone to be positioned next to environmental hazards, right? More prone to have to bear the brunt of negative externalities and development, more prone to have to deal with the effects of investment through displacement, right? These same value systems still undergird all of our, not only our belief systems and our economic models, but our practices as institutions today. And that's some of the work that ESC is trying to undo.
It's incredible as someone who loves Atlanta. You've got all these Atlanta magazine. People can't see this, but you've got all these Atlanta magazine posters behind you. I was telling you how I never miss an episode. I grew up in Alabama, but I've lived in Atlanta for quite a while now, and I've really learned to love the city as imperfect as it is. But when you learn about the history of Atlanta, and probably any city, you see how racism has been perpetuated in ways big and small. Like even the growth of the freeway system in Atlanta had racism at its core, like where they put houses and how they used eminent domain and things to impact some neighborhoods and leave other neighborhoods alone. Right. Like when you really start to see it, it's kind of everywhere. There's a great park in Atlanta, Grant Park, a beautiful park where the zoo is, and it used to have one of the largest pools in the city and in the Southeast, and it was bricked over. I mean, it was cemented over when pools were desegregated. And so there's just all these ways in which sort of the landscape of the city has been shaped by racial injustice and ways that racism has impacted something as sort of seemingly small as where a street goes. And I think when you start to see it, it's everywhere. So let's keep on this theme of cities. I had always read that Atlanta was there was greater economic disparity in Atlanta than any other city in America. I wanted to verify that before we got on today, and I checked, and I found different places said different things, but Atlanta was consistently in the top 5, and places like Atlanta, Miami, and New Orleans consistently showed up among places with the highest levels of income inequality. At the city level, what drives these huge divisions in economic disparity?
Yeah, that's a huge and loaded question, right? And I guess the first way I would respond to that is to say, one, to take into account the history, right? How do we get here, right? Atlanta has become the crown jewel of the South. It's an economic engine that drives regional prosperity, not even just local in the sense of the state. And a lot of the wealth that had been generated prior to this point, right, and again, off the backs of extractive labor practices or through chattel slavery, et cetera, already creates kind of this first hurdle of wealth gap that we have to account for, right? In the wake of that, and there are a number of different things policy-wise that have contributed to this. One, the restrictions on or the repressing of the right to unionize or organize labor, right, which suppresses wages for families. When we think about things like the fact that our growth has become exponentially tied to corporatism here in the state of Georgia, right? That we brand ourselves as the number one place to do business, but we've got flat wages, right? And wage stagnation. We've got very little local hiring that occurs, right? So when we think about the ways in which our economic systems have been generating value for people in certain places of the country, that there's not a lot of consideration as to how do we bring along our local residents, right? And those people who have been legacy to the city of Atlanta into that growth, right? And so when we look at kind of this convergence of all these different factors, even outside of the fact that Atlanta being kind of considered the home of the Black middle class, right? In particular of the Southeast and of America as a whole, right? And I'll say this until the day I die. I love this city. I was born here and raised here. That there's nowhere else in the world like the city of Atlanta. However, right, that we also have a fixation and a value that our Black community has tied itself to around kind of the shiny things, right? This idea that we're investing ourselves in our personal growth and accountability in a way that's not always communal in focus. Right. And so how do we make sure that as we continue to see and experience growth, and of course, we're no one saying that we don't want to have a thriving economic and vibrant city, right, that we have to be considerate about those different things that are restricting everyone's access and ability to come along with us. That goes into systemic things like bank lending, right, or rates of lending or procurement, right, at the local level, how government contracting is used to gather goods and services or procure goods and services to help in government operations. Right. We think about things like I said, from the wage stagnation or the wage theft that happens a lot of times in this process. And how do we do a better job doing things like profit and revenue sharing, right? Different sorts of economic models that can really drive this conversation forward. But to answer your original question, a lot of those things have been very insidiously kind of tied into our political sphere or our policy scape that have restricted the ability for everyone to thrive and grow economically as the city thrives. The other thing I would be remiss to not also mention, and you talked a little bit about kind of what happened in Grant Park, right, is that in its rush to grow and in its pursuit of growth, the city of Atlanta has at time and time again disenfranchised people who were furthest away from opportunity, right? We think about this through the way that we've seen communities develop and be raised and or displaced wholly, right? The most recent example of those being the Hope 6 projects, right? That when the Atlanta Olympics was coming, right, that there was a concerted effort to clear, right, a slum clearing, quote unquote, effort in the city to move and displace all of the different Hope 6 residents, those people who have been a part of those different housing projects, public housing developments. And so a lot of those people were moved completely out of the city, right, to places that would, take their vouchers, their Section 8 vouchers, et cetera, that were outside of the city of Atlanta. And so, again, there's this value proposition that as much as we want to brand ourselves as being kind of this Black Mecca, that we haven't always lived up to those values in a way that has been ensuring or protective of. And that is in a city that has been in continuous Black leadership, right, democratically and through our political scape, that there has not always been an effort to align this value of communalism or collectivism and protection of the most disenfranchised people into the way that our workers continue to grow and to thrive in our economic space. And the most recent example of that, of course, being Cop City, right, and the conversations that are happening on that side. And so how do we make sure that in the work of PSC, that as we move towards a shared prosperity model, that we emphasize the shared part, that everyone has a part that they can play in that, and that we all should be looking to promote and bring on-ramps for everyone to have a role to play, and that they can enjoy the growth of our beautiful city together.
So I'm going to go off script here, because this is something I feel like your answer embodied this nicely. It's like you have a great love and a great enthusiasm and belief in Atlanta and the Southeast, but you balance that with sort of a recognition of some of the systemic realities of how things are. And you think about a city like Atlanta, who's sort of famously called the city too busy to hate. And in some ways, I think that is true. Like, I think in Atlanta, I think you're more likely to see a Black person and a white person having lunch, sharing a meal and a laugh than just about any other place in America. But at the same time, that reputation can kind of paper over injustices that truly exist. And I guess that's one of the things that I'll take it from a psychological perspective, right? On the one hand, we don't want to fall into this, what psychologists call the just world phenomenon, or this belief that like everybody starts at the same starting line, because we know that's not true. And we need to be aware of those differences and we need to accommodate them. But on the other hand, I think if we become too mired in negativity or hopelessness, which I think it can go that way fast, I think that there's an element of, again, psychologically learned helplessness there. It's almost to me like balancing optimism for the future and hope for growth and positivity with a recognition of the past. And that's hard to do. And I find a lot of people have a hard time maintaining that balance and either fall into sort of a woe is me, things have been bad, they're always going to be bad camp, or that was a long time ago, suck it up, get over it, move on. And I don't think that either of those things is the right answer. So here's an impossible question. How do you balance those sort of two perspectives to sort of maximize outcomes and maximize progress?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for me and for our organization, we think about that through the transformative value of love and empathy, right? I can acknowledge history, right? Because we have to acknowledge history. One, because we've seen even politically now that there's still an effort to, one, erase history, right, actively, or to suppress story and narrative, right? And if we can't get to the point of even openly acknowledging what history is or what has been the fact of history, right, because that becomes debatable at that point, then it leaves open the opportunity to, one, reintroduce things that have already been tried or done, right? It's a very easy and slippery slope to undo the seeming progress that we thought we've had done over the last several decades, right? And so how do we make sure that we're protecting against those types of attacks on the offensive through protecting the power and the honoring of the written word and narrative and of truth, right? And those historical narratives that have, historically been disenfranchised or kind of cast aside over time, right? And so when we think about, to your question, how do we balance the two? Like, we see, one, love as being a transformative value. And when we talk about, even to your previous question about our economic scape, right? How do we get away from this idea that there's a zero-sum game in the middle of our economic system, right? And that we have to have love and empathy and that, again, communal thought, right? And this thought that we're all in this together, right? This thread that weaves us all together is this human experience, that we have to have love and practicing our empathy, right? In very active ways to tie us together with the community that helps us to see the value and the hope, right? I think a lot of times hope is a choice, right? I can look at all the data many times ahead of me, and I can be overwhelmed by the prognostications or the assumptions about what our world is going to be and become, or even the fact that like we've been fighting this fight and some people get burnt out over. And in reality, like this fight has not been going on that long, right? It's been 400 years of oppression, and we're only about 60 years removed from the start of the civil rights movement, right? And so we've got a long way to go. And so I tell people all the time, one, that I choose hope, right? And I choose love, because if we don't choose those things first, then nothing else is going to matter on the other side of it, right? Then we're just going to be doing work that's going to rebuild systems that are void of the thing that's necessary to transform them. The other side of that, I think about the ability to make a space for joy, right? That we're not going to win the war today, right? And we're probably not going to win the war tomorrow. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to make, transformative change in the way that our economy and our society operates in this way in my lifetime. But if it doesn't happen, right, that doesn't mean that the fight wasn't worth it. And so in the midst of that longitudinal perspective, right, we try to never get ourselves too burnt out on any particular issue, right? That some people run really white hot about something that really is passionate to them and that they're passionate about. And then on the other side of that, they burn themselves out of anger and frustration and fear, right? And in reality, like we have to make space for joy, to celebrate small wins, to take deep breaths, and just to make space for regenerative action for ourselves. Right. And then to continually center that, like I said, that love and that care for other people and for the human experience. Right. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's going to make sure that we transform the life that we're seeing in the society that we're in. And so I don't know if that's a right answer to your question, as much as it's the way that I kind of go about my daily basis of just trying to manage the two sides of this coin. Right. Because it can be heavy, and this work is hard work as much as anything else. And so how do you make sure that you protect yourself, that you enrich yourself, and what do you allow into your spirit, right? Always matters at the same time. And so for me, I just continually center hope and love.
Yeah, I think love and hope are always the right answer. I think that's a great answer. Go back to when I was a therapist, the first session was always about the installation of hope. That was like job one in that first session. And there's this quote, people who've listened to the show before will know that I've said it before. I'll say it again here. Psychologist Rollo May has this saying that depression is the inability to construct a future, right? Like if you don't have that future vision, you don't have much. And so I guess for me, that's kind of the balance I'm always trying to strike is reality about how things have been, how they continue to be, try and understand that reality, but also try and instill hope for the future. It's an imperfect balance, but I think one we need to strike. So this is right. Oh, go ahead.
I can add on to, and it's something you use the term construct the future, right? And I love the fact that you said that, because the future is ours to create, right? I have a quote that I like to lean on by a economist out of Europe, Marika van Doornik, and she talks about that economics is not a human science. It's not a natural science. It's a social science, right? Meaning that it's something that we constructed, right? The laws of how money moves or how people relate to one another within society are not etched in stone, right? We can change these things. And so I tell my team all the time, and when I do different trainings, I talk about the need to bring creativity into our work, to bring beauty and art into our work, and to think with a future-oriented mindset, because we have to try to create a society that we've never seen and existed. Like if it wasn't chattel slavery and racism in America, it was the caste system, right? And the way that people were related and relegated to social class in different ways, or, colorism in different parts of the world. Like there's always been some sort of social hierarchy that is based either on kind of earned status or ascribed status, or race and or gender, or colorism even within races, right? And so we have to think outside the box in the way that we're constructing the future that we want to see, because we've never seen examples of where we really were able to dwell together as people in an equitable society. And so I love the fact that you use the term construct, because it's on us to create the things that we want to see that will, bring that into fruition. And I think that's something that we can do.
You know, one of the thing about economic systems and economic realities is they tend to reify the world, and they tend to make it seem more real than it is. Mm-hmm. So I think it's good to take a step back and say, look, this is a man-made thing, right? You know, I lived in Southeast Asia, and colorism was a huge thing. And people trying to bleach their skin, and you would see this, and people discriminated. You would even see very blatantly in job descriptions. You'd see a posting for a job, and it would very directly say, like, you know, must be this tall, must be light skinned. And it's incredible. Like, we built this mess, you know, we built this mess, and we can unbuild it. And I think a lot of times you got to take that step back and say, what's real here, and what's a human creation, and what can we do about it? So I came across a statistic this week that absolutely blew my mind, and running across it was perfect timing, because I get to talk to someone smart like you about it, who thinks about these things. The estimate was having to do with wealth inequality, and how marriage is one of the primary drivers of wealth inequality. The study that I saw this week said 33% of wealth inequality was driven by marriage decisions. And I ran across other research that has it as high as 40%. And I was like shocked to see that at first. But then when you think about it, you're like, well, no, that makes total sense. Wealthy people hang in wealthy circles. You know, you meet your girlfriend, boyfriend at private school or at an Ivy League college, or in a white collar workplace, and that's the crowd you're running with. And then you marry those people, and you inherit familial wealth, and you pass it on to your kids. And like the cycle just goes and goes. When you see that, that's not a malicious thing, right? I mean, that's a very organic decision. Your proximity is the biggest predictor of who you marry. When some of the drivers of wealth inequality are so organic like this, what's to be done about lessening wealth inequality when the way that it gets exacerbated is so sort of everyday?
Yeah. I'm going to flip that question on its head a little bit, and I'm not disagreeing with the quote or the statistic, is that we have to think about the history of the Black family in America and how it relates to our current day circumstance, right? That coming into the country, that there was a separation of Black families through enslavement, right? That husbands and wives were separated, mothers from children, siblings, right? That this entire dynamic created a significant trauma through the Black community that we're still living through today. That's one aspect of it. Coming out of enslavement, right, there was an effort through Jim Crow and the Black codes, et cetera, to recreate the system of enslavement through the prison pipelines, where we saw things like vagrancy laws enacted, or laws against congregation of Black peoples, right, where there was an active and concerted effort to repopulate this enslavement pipeline through the labor and the talent of Black males in particular, taking them again out of the home and out of the community, right? Coming into the turn of the century, and when we started to construct publicly subsidized housing and things of that nature, where we started to look at the way in which the government played a more active role in providing safety nets for families and communities of color, that there was a focus on the fact that if a male was in the home, that families could not receive equal benefits, right? Or benefits that they might have otherwise been entitled to if a male was present in the home, right? Again, incentivizing the lack of presence of males in the home. And then, of course, into the 90s, of course, we see the acceleration of the prison pipeline through like the three strikes laws, you know, the war on drugs, right? Of course, and all of these things being subsequently, again, preying on Black males, right? And so that creates an environment where the family structure is not traditionally accepted or seen the same way as it might be in some other racial communities, right? The other thing that I have to take into account into this is asset class. And so when you talk about marriage and family, and this isn't speaking against marriage at all, but one, the ability to generate two incomes versus one, right, is a big driver in generating or accelerating wealth. So now instead of me being, I earn a median income of about $60,000, and I marry a woman, accounting for the fact that there is a disparity between the earnings gap for men and women, who might make $45,000. Now, instead of me being a household of one making 60, I'm a household of two making over 100, right? So that inflates my asset classing. If I buy or use the two incomes to buy a home or a property, that inflates my asset classing, right? And so when you look at all of these things together, that you say, well, I've generated assets based on these two incomes, and we have this two income that's contributing to higher liquidity, lower debt, etc., then naturally that partnership that's component to the marriage is going to generate a different output as far as wealth generation or creation on the other side. Of course, we look at things like, children, as children are introduced, and the kind of communal nature of raising children. In one hand, you might look at it and say, well, two-parent households are the standard. They need to be together. On another, you might say, well, what's most important is to have a family support system and a network of supports that may be blood related or may be fictive kin, right? It's just a matter of how you've got those supports and those networks to generate value in a communal or a family setting. But it's less about one being preferable over the other than more that we have to think about broadening our definitions about what's acceptable. And so that's the only thing I was going to turn this kind of question on its head, is about proximity. When we talk about proximity to whiteness and white values, right, that's a form of implicit bias, right? And how that's something that is reinforced over time through data, et cetera. And sometimes those are affirmed in certain ways. And so I'm not saying that to challenge that data set in and of itself. I haven't seen it and can't really speak to it to that level of degree, other than my first thought is, what type of way do we look at and construct this definition about marriage and the way it contributes to wealth outside of just asset classing? And that's more inclusive of the lived experience of people of color in this country, where our families have been constantly decimated through public policy decisions and other, if that makes sense.
No, it does. So, I mean, you've just given, I think, a master class on the way that public policy has sort of eroded and sort of disincentivized the creation of strong Black families. And that is, I think, a driver in what we're talking about here. The data set in question, though, is basically saying rich people marry rich people. And rich people marry rich people. Rich people then pass on their assets to their children, pass them on to their children and have a head start. And sort of the cycle gets exacerbated because of what is, I think, a very natural tendency for wealthy people to marry people in their circle who are also wealthy, and for the wealth gap to widen. Yeah. I see this as a very sort of, a very natural thing, right? Not that it's a good or a bad thing, but it's certainly a natural thing. In the face of that, like, money makes money, right? Money makes money and wealth begets wealth. With that being the case, what practical steps can we take to narrow the wealth gap where, I look at so many of my peers, and I mean, I work in finance. This is an industry that's, folks are highly compensated. There's lots of opportunity there. But I'd say, many of my peers are arriving at a place in their careers where their investments are kicking off, well north of the average North American salary. I mean, that's just not something that's available to most folks. When money makes money, and when class begets, when high socioeconomic status begets higher socioeconomic status, how do we begin to unravel this thorny problem when there seems to be so much momentum keeping it in place, I guess?
Yeah. That makes me think about, to affirm on that data, there was some data that recently came out from Opportunity Insights and Dr. Raj Chetty, and they were talking about the relationship between social mobility, right, and essentially human capital, like who and being exposed to people of different income classes being supportive of the pursuit of economic mobility, right? And so to your point, right, one, you have to be in spaces that are more integrated, right? And to answer that question, right, it's one thing to say, well, I'm going to fall in love with the person who's available, right, who's the person I spend my time with or who's in the social circle that I'm in. And to a degree, a lot of those social circles are graded or reinforced through, again, policy and policy decisions, right? If you were to say right now, functionally, that most communities in Atlanta are segregated, you would probably say, no, that's not true, right? But the reality is that zip code is a very clear determinant, right, of your future life outcomes here in the city of Atlanta, right? The Black Mecca. So if you're low income and born into a low income family, you have just a 4% chance to make it into one of the upper income quartiles, right? In Atlanta, right? The land of Black opportunity, right? And so we have to account for this relationship between social mobility and economic mobility in ways that create more opportunity for people to meet and interact with other people. One, that increases their ability to empathize with people of different lived experiences, right? That's the first thing. The second, and in doing this, there are ways that public policy can be used that can create or support mixed income, diverse, socioeconomic community building, right? We see right now across the city, and there are a couple of different phenomena I'll talk about. One being in the rush to urbanize, right? To increase urban infill, we've only been building out, and this of course ties into the city's affordable housing challenge, luxury housing, multifamily luxury, single family of scale, right? But there's no affordable housing, which means that we're only segregating housing around people who have the assets to live in certain communities through asset class, right? And so that means those who might not have access to those same resources are then functionally pushed out of the city or pushed out of that opportunity to participate, right? And so then you create and you functionally segregate people of low wealth to certain communities or certain areas where they then have to commune with each other. Again, going to your point around social mobility, there's not a lot of opportunity if I live outside of the city in a relatively low wealth area, let's say, for example, Clayton County, right? If I grew up in a low wealth community in Clayton County, which for a time was one of the poorest metro counties, the odds of me meeting and interacting with somebody who I might one day choose to marry that is of a higher income class than me is pretty low, right, on the front end of that, right? And so that's a way that public policy or decisions and practices around policy are driving segregation in community that then needs to be undone, to your point about creating more opportunity for intermingling. The other thing I would be remiss to not talk about is in the event where there are Black families who have, defined their relationship with each other to say that they want to be married and they want to build a life together, that there's also a cyclical process and systemic process that's right now occurring around wealth theft, right? And the opportunity for Black families to use their resources and their assets to generate wealth at the same rate as their white counterparts. There's a book called Know Your Price by Dr. Andre Perry, right, from Brookings Institute. And he talks about the systemic way that Black wealth is being stolen, right, through land capture, right? And we have seen in the news, of course, really recently about the different Black families around the country who are going through the process of selling their homes, and they have to whitewash their homes to generate equal value from their property as their white counterparts, right? That there's beneath the surface, there's this value system that drives this idea that things that are Black are less valuable, right? Whether that be the same home in different communities, whether that be the same home or asset type, right, that might look different from block to block. You know, of course, we know through redlining that there are streets in Atlanta that are differently named just because that there were white people who did not want to be associated with living on the same street as where the Black community was, right? Or the homeowners, law corporations, redlining maps, right, which would define where Black people could and could not live. You know, in some places it would be literally a block over from one another where they would change names, right? Just to make sure that there was no kind of quote unquote intermingling of the definitions of where people lived or where they were allowed to live, et cetera. And so looking across this historic context, there's been a lot that's been done to restrict and or redefine what is valuable through the eyes of the white gaze, right? That particularly those things that have been owned by Black people. And so to answer your question, there has to be both a concerted effort to create more spaces for intermingling or interlearning between people of different socioeconomic or different racial classes together. And then also create a space where, you know, there are people who have generated revenue or generated assets that are not being valued equally on the private market as they would if they were owned or controlled by someone who was white or of European descent. And so how do we deal with both of those sides of the equation? in order to create one, more opportunity for mobility, but then two, more opportunity to generate full return on the investment for Black and brown families.
I love both parts of that answer. I found it, very thorough and very practical. And, one of the things that you talked a lot about social mobility in that last piece, and the last question before I get to some fun Atlanta questions is, the U.S. is 27th in the world in social mobility. And I think that would surprise a lot of people. And we're between Lithuania and Spain, and no diss on Lithuania and Spain, but I think that would surprise a lot of people to be the U.S., Lithuania has, the American dream is more easily realized in Lithuania than it is in America. I think that would be kind of shocking to a lot of folks. You just gave a great two-part answer there. With respect to social mobility and having things like zip code become less determinative of people's future economic prospects, is there anything you haven't said that you would sort of espouse in terms of us moving up that ladder and becoming, I think, more of who we want to be and more of who we hold ourselves out to be?
Oh, man, that's a great question. Plenty of great questions, of course, in this interview. I would think about, and you've heard me talk about, kind of two values I would definitely want to raise in this answer. One, about the value of communal thought, right? And America has become a land built on the construction or the idea of individualism, right? That you can be what you want to be, right? And that's not a bad thing in and of itself, outside of in the places where it starts to erode the social contract, right, between people, right? That we are a country that our law is created within the idea of the social contract in mind, that my rights begin where your rights end, right? And we haven't done enough to reinforce communal thought outside of very specific patriotic, imperialistic bordering ways, right? Where we have things like the Olympics, where it's all of America versus all of somebody else, right? Or through war, right? Where it's us versus them, and then us becomes all of us collectively, right? But outside of that, it's very much so no, this is the American dream. You're going to work as hard as you need to do to get what you want. And it becomes dismissive of the system because it's very much so focused on the individual. And so this idea that in order to get to these places that we have to really promote communal thought is something that I would really reinforce. And I've been going back over the last few months, rereading just some older, I'm not gonna say old, writers of the Black past, right? Those people who are considered part of the Black literary canon, right? Or the literary canon in broad, right? That we should be respecting them as. And I was reading Alice Walker, and she talked about how in the aftermath of enslavement, that in this newly emancipated Black community, that there was this understanding that no matter what you had, if you didn't have, that it was so much a matter of us all surviving together that people were going to figure out how to work together to make that happen. The example she gave was about birthing babies, right? That there was, if there was someone in the community who was expecting and they were going into labor and they didn't have the money to pay someone, the midwife or the doctor, to come out and support them, then they said, well, we'll barter with what you got, right? That because it's so important for us to survive that we're going to do what's necessary in the pursuit of communal support, that we're going to make sure that this baby lives and that you live, and then we'll work the rest out later, right? And so we've gotten away from that type of community, right, across our country. And even when I say community in a broad sense, even down to our neighborhoods, right, that there's so much tribalism that has cropped up that it forces us to live in constant confrontation with one another, right? And so I would definitely say that'd be the first thing around this idea of communalism. Regeneration and healing, I think, are big pieces of this conversation. I can't go into depth on all of those things. I know we're tight on time, but there's this idea that in order to create space for regeneration, that you have to make space for healing, right? That people have to be in position to confront either the sins of their own past or the ways that these things have been weaponized against people in certain ways and how that has contributed to a certain lived experience for others, right? And how do we live and coexist in a space where we can both own, like there are things that we can collectively do better and grow our world from there, right? That we have been in this and we are going to be in this together. And then third, regeneration. Like that's this idea about equity and justice, not just about this pursuit of economic growth for all, right? Or growth for whatever particular group is in a specific space, but how do we think about accounting for the gaps, right? Or the resourcing or the investments needed to really further support and generate and drive the type of growth that we want to see, equitable growth and shared prosperity. The last example I'll leave you with in that is through the city of Atlanta. Of course, we were doing some research right now that we call the DEED project, Demanding Equitable Economic Development. And we're doing and finalizing a white paper that looks at the use of tax allocation districts right across the metro area, and particularly in the city of Atlanta, and how they've been drivers of displacement, essentially through property tax abatements to incentivize private development in under-resourced or underserved communities. And so when you look at the way that these maps are generally drawn, they're usually centered around low-wealth communities alone, which one either is going to rob that community of necessary property tax resources when investment does come to help to disrupt the cycle of poverty and disinvestment on its face. Of course, we know property taxes being used for government services, supports, all of those other types of things, right? And so if you say, well, we're just going to focus this only on this low income community, then on its face, it sounds like a good practice, right? Well, there's a low income area, it needs resourcing. We're going to use this tool to incentivize and drive development in this place. But what ends up happening oftentimes is that when investment comes and it specifically starts to displace people, because there is no mixed income function to one, attract additional investment into the community, because if it's only generated or segregated to a low wealth space, that there's no impetus or no value for an institution to come and invest in the space. And so how do you create value on both sides through mixed income communities or drawing of those types of maps and lines in a way that one incentivizes the investment and then protects against the displacement through creating opportunity for economic mobility for all in that particular design or development as well. And so these are ideas around how you can take kind of this regenerative value or this idea that we can all collectively coexist in our economic space and start to put them into practice through public policy or other types of tools. And so I would just say those would be the three things I would probably lead with. Like I said, just one, focusing on moving away from kind of this toxic individualism, the communal thought, and focusing on healing, regeneration, and investment for justice. And I would say those would be the things I would leave the group with.
You know, we've spent some time talking about balancing different perspectives on this podcast. And, you know, when you look at the happiest countries in the world, they're countries that in a very real sense have learned to balance the best parts of, you know, the rugged individualism with community support. And, you know, I'm thinking mostly of Canada, the Scandinavian countries and others. They've really learned to balance these things. And I know that in America, like we really lean hard on the rugged individualism piece, and anything that's sort of communal in nature can seem a little suspicious, I think, to an American value system sometime. And again, I think it's about balance. There's a lot we do right. There's a lot we do well. But I think there's more room in America for reduced levels of tribalism, like you said, and more sort of love your neighbor, certainly.
Well, there's, you know, it's a lot that you can get into the history as to why we see that. You know, the most direct thing we can point to, of course, being the relationship between America and communism or communist countries, and this idea that communal thought or communal action is a form or offshoot of socialism or communism, and then therefore it is the enemy, and we've been kind of programmed to think that way. When in reality, you know, these types of communal structures, both economically and other, have both predated capitalism and continue to thrive within it. And so that's one of the things that we're committing ourselves to organizationally, is how do we support, and we're pushing our partners to do the same, both on the philanthropic and social sector side. How do we start to bring some of these things out of the shadows, right? And, you know, we think about those things kind of being at the fringes of society, but they're actively operating and they're actively showing themselves to be viable alternatives to the way that we've seen. You know, you mentioned earlier how capitalist systems or economic systems seem to kind of have this self-reinforcing mechanism within them. But we have to continue to elevate that there are other ways that we can live and exist. And in our pursuit of creating a different or constructing a different tomorrow, that we have tools in our tool belt that we just haven't done a great job of using, right? And so we are definitely committed to making sure people know more about that.
All right. Well, this has been an important conversation, but before I let you go, we both love Atlanta. We want more people to love Atlanta. So I just got a couple of lightning round questions for you. What's your favorite part of living in Atlanta?
Man, the culture. I love, it is a city that has its own vibration. It's a city that attracts people who kind of move to their own beat, but it's kind of like never, and I'm speaking specifically from the Black perspective, it's like you never meet someone that's unfamiliar, right? And it's like a big, small city. Even if you don't have a personal relationship with them, the way that we dance, the way we move, I think to that pursuit of that communal spirit, that a lot of that already is naturally existent here. And that we have the power to shape narrative here and create futures. And that's something that I enjoy the most.
Yeah, I got a hoodie that says Atlanta influences everything. And I've really seen that to be the case. I won't name the state, but I recently...
Well, shout out to Bane Joyner and the Atlanta Influences Everything team, by the way. They're good partners of ours. Love them, and you, of course. I definitely had to give them that subtle shout out.
No, definitely. I recently spent some time in another state, and I won't diss another state, but I came back to Atlanta, and the first thing that I told, I rode MARTA back up to my house and just had some interactions with folks, and as soon as I got back home, I told my wife, I'm like, I've just missed the characters. Like, I've missed the characters in Atlanta. There's so many great characters in Atlanta and in the South generally. Come hang with them. Best food in Atlanta.
Definitely wings. Always got to go with a good hot wing, man. It's hard to find. I actually was in Minneapolis last week, and I was shocked that they had some wings I tried that could challenge Atlanta for some pretty good ones. But definitely the wings, you can't really find good wings in other parts of the country.
Did they have lemon pepper wet in Minneapolis though?
They did not have lemon pepper wet. They had a dry rub and a buffalo, which of course is completely different than mild and or lemon pepper wet.
Yeah, there you go. Favorite Atlanta artist?
Oh, gotta go with Outkast, man. Like, they are the gold standard for Atlanta. Much of the music, and really the whole Dungeon family, much of the music always rings true. On the newer artist side, I've really been into JID, into Jid, man, with Dreamville. He's making some great music, great lyricists. Really excited to see where his career goes. And Kenny Mason, too. A young dude out of the city, man, who makes some great music, a little bit mashup style, some different genres that, some people might enjoy. So those are definitely my ATL top 3 right now. Yeah,
Outkast has got to be my number 1 all time, but there's some other non-hip hop artists too. Fabe Webster has a great album. Fabe Webster, great album. Run the Jewels, of course, only 50% Atlanta, but we're gonna round up and say that's an Atlanta artist.
Absolutely.
Mastodon, a good metal band out of Atlanta. So Atlanta's got a little bit of everything. Known for being a hip hop mecca, but really some great music coming out of Atlanta. So this has been fantastic. If people want to learn more about you, if they want to learn more about your organization, where can folks find you online?
You all can find us online at http www.psequity.org. You can reach me directly at S Johnson, that's first initial last name, S Johnson at psequity.org. Of course, we're on all socials. Twitter, I believe, is PS Equity Matters, but the others, Facebook, LinkedIn, I think it's Partnership for Southern Equity. And then on Instagram, we are on at PS Equity as well. So plug in with us. We do a lot of different opportunities, programming for the community, different resident leader trainings or workforce programs, et cetera, young people programs. We're, of course, getting ready to kick off the summer cycle. So there's going to be a lot of programming coming down the pipe. So if anyone who's listening is interested and wants to know more about our org or how to support or to just share information about one of our programs, definitely reach out to me or check us on the socials.
All right, Sterling, it's been great. Thank you.
So wait, one more thing. I would be remiss to not also add in this October, Southern Unity for Racial Justice and Equity, the Surge Summit in Memphis, Tennessee. We're looking at bringing together people across the Southeast. We talked a little bit in our interview about healing, right? And there had been a very specific relationship between Atlanta and Memphis in particular, as Atlanta being the place of Dr. King's birth, right? And Memphis being the place where he was assassinated. And so we're looking to address and to bring a space for healing, celebration, and support, and for uplifting solutions to these types of challenges we're dealing with from a number of different perspectives, outside of even economically, through land use and development, growth, health, and social determinants of health, climate justice, etc. So we would love for everyone to come out and be a part of what we're doing. You will see information on the Surge Summit on our website, again, at psequity.org, and hope to see everyone there.
All right, everyone, check it out. Sterling, thank you so much for your time today.
For sure. I appreciate it again.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.